So first, I just want to thank you all for taking the time out of your evening to come and listen to me talk today. Most of the prepared talk is kind of focused on the history of events in Ukraine, but I wanted to make sure that we had ample time to do Q&A and talk about some of my personal experiences. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of dive into this and work through these things. It's only natural for us to seek explanations for and the roots of conflict. For scholars, political decision makers, and pundits, questions loom at every turn. Why and how did this happen? What is Putin thinking? What comes next? Will there be a nuclear war? I am trained as a historian of Central and Eastern Europe, right? So I have a research and writing record in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as comparative migrations and diaspora with research emphases in topics that are in Ukraine. So I've been thinking about Ukraine for a long time. But I am a historian. I'm not a mind reader, nor am I a psychic. Thus, while I can make educated guesses about what comes next or about Putin's internal dialogues, I really have little to offer in that regard, right? That's not what I do, and I can't answer those questions. But as a historian of this place, here is what I do know. The Russian Federation is an empire. Its predecessor state, the Soviet Union, was an empire. And the one that predated that, the Russian Empire, was, well, an empire, right? And the Russian Federation is doing what Russia has historically always done. It's behaving like an empire, and it's using some of the Russian Federation's most favored tools, including extreme violence, Russification, moral and physical degradation, rhetoric and propaganda, and of course, geopolitical peacocking. Now, while Russia has been an empire, Ukrainians have habitually resisted Russian imperialism, increasingly so over the 20th and 21st centuries. Almost without exception, the Russian Empire and its successor states have responded to this resistance with extreme violence, and in at least one instance, genocide. This spirit of resistance continues in contemporary Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora. It is for this reason, and many others, that the recent uptick in Russian aggression did not wield Putin's desired results. As opposed to quickly folding, Ukrainians fought back. They continue to fight back, and in many instances, they are winning major victories against the much larger and patronizing neighbor that they have to the east. In February and March of 2002, this really surprised politicians and pundits, and it also baffled Cold War Russianist scholars like Stephen Kotkin, who in a March 2022 New Yorker article predicted a Ukrainian failure. He said, quote, "Ukraine is winning this war only on Twitter, not on the battlefield. They are not winning this war," end quote. Now, Ukrainianists and scholars like myself really scoffed at Kotkin's analysis. We knew then that Ukrainians would fight to the last man, woman, and child to protect what they had built. Here we are, a year later now, a little over a year later, and Ukrainians are still fighting and in many instances winning. Over the past year, much of the international community has grown to respect Ukrainian grit. And this is now really a reoccurring theme in popular culture. And you can see that here in the Banksy piece, which has become rather popular, the David and Goliath piece that popped up in a small Ukrainian town overnight. I think it's important usually at this point in the talk that I also address what I mean by Ukrainians, because there are a lot of competing claims about what exactly it means to be Ukrainian. Increasingly, especially over the past 25 years, Ukraine is developing a civic national identity in which one does not necessarily have to be ethnically Ukrainian to belong to the Ukrainian nation. Historically, this is not the first time this has been the case. This was certainly the case in the first Ukrainian People's Republic, where they initially built in minority protections as part of the state. But there have also historically been moments where Ukrainian nationalism took another form, this kind of Ukraine for Ukrainians form, and state the state of Ukraine and most of the Ukrainian people have been working over the past 25, even 100 years to try to turn away from this less desirable form of nationalism, right? This has been a really long and difficult process predicated on incremental progress towards democracy and civic understandings of belonging. So on the eve of the February 24th escalation, Ukraine had, despite Russian meddling, demonstrated its commitment to these values via peaceful transitions of power and the election of a new kind of president, ethnically Ukrainian and Jewish, Russian-speaking, and unafraid of challenging the remnants of the Ukrainian oligarchic establishment. After his election in 2019, he really became the butt of jokes, right? A TV president turned the real deal. However, Mr. Putin at that moment and the Russian establishment saw him as a decisive threat. He embodied everything that they feared. He represented a Ukraine where one could speak Russian, be Jewish, and fight for democracy. And Russia was right. Zelensky was a threat to Russia's imperialist and totalitarian ambitions in Ukraine. He is a more than capable wartime leader and remains steadfast in his claims that nobody is going to break us. It is also important to note that contrary to Mr. Putin's dubious claims, the Russian and Ukrainian languages and cultures are not one and the same. Russian and Ukrainian history, however, is connected, right? The two peoples share origins in Kievan Rus, and they developed alongside one another as neighbors over centuries. Sometimes they resided in the same empire or the same state together, and other times they did not, as was the case with Ukrainians in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Habsburg Empire, and interwar Poland. Relationships between Russians and Ukrainians in shared spaces were sometimes friendly. However, more than often, these relations have been plagued by tensions. Increasingly over the 20th century, this hostility has resulted in intergroup violence. One of the largest points of contention between the two groups has been Russia's assertions of imperialism over Ukrainians and Ukraine. And this fraught relationship has been further complicated by Ukraine's geography. It's important to understand that while today I'm talking about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, Russia has never been the only imperial power that's eyeing Ukrainian territory, right? So this is always happening in conversation with other empires. So while I would love to delve into it, we will have to save topics like Polish-Ukrainian relations for another day. So today in the short period that we have together, I would like to offer kind of a brief overview of Russian imperial violence in Ukraine over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. Some of this may be familiar to you. I know that some of the conversations that were once relegated just to Ukrainianists and Ukrainian circles are now occurring on TV screens, right? So hopefully you've heard of some of these events. But I think by bringing them together and thinking about them in a continuum, it can help us think about the ways in which current Russian violence in Ukraine is not a radical break with Russian policy, but actually a continuation of Russian policy. So how far back do we go for this, right? I'm going to try not to give you every event on a timeline because we do not have all day. But the place where I think Russia enjoys starting and Mr. Putin enjoys starting is really with Kievan Rus. But I don't want to go that far back. So we're going to start with the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. And this was, it was something that emerged out of Kievan Rus after the Mongols had really decimated the area. So this was the first iteration of really what we are moving towards what is contemporary Russia. It lasted until 1547, and it included absolutely none of contemporary Ukrainian territory. This entity then expanded into the Tsardom of Rus in 1547 and lasted until 1721. And even after tremendous imperial expansion, this included less than a third of what is contemporary Ukrainian territory. The Tsardom of Rus then transformed into what we now know as the Russian Empire. And it's during this period, the Russian imperial period, that you see the largest expansion of the Russian Empire into what is contemporary Ukrainian territory. Much of this is done under Catherine the Great. And so large swaths of contemporary Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, Kherson, Mykolaiv is what that should say. This was formerly Ottoman territory. And then large swaths of over here, right? This is contemporary Ukrainian territory, including places like Lviv. This was not even part of the Russian Empire, never was part of the Russian Empire. So you have this transition in which the Russian Empire is really starting in this smaller area near like kind of the north there, and then it's expanding outward over the course of centuries. And as it expands outward, it increasingly runs into the large populations that are here, right? Including places like Ukraine and Belarus. In at least, or in the last of these listed imperial formations, the Russian Empire, Ukrainians constituted one of the largest minority groups in the Russian Empire, even though all of Ukraine was not in the Russian Empire. Here, of course, we have to be really careful with the term minority, right? Because they're technically the majority or the second or parallel majority in Ukrainian territory. However, against the larger backdrop of the Russian Empire, they're a minority. The Tsars really struggled with this population. And this is because it's not only a Ukrainian space, but it really was a multilingual, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic population. And they wanted to bring this land of multis, as we like to call it, into the Russian fold. So they were trying to figure out ways how to bring this into the Russian fold. And they found that there was a group that was particularly difficult for them to do that with. And you've probably heard this before, it's the Cossacks, right? And there are a couple different groups of Cossacks. We're not talking about the Don Cossacks, we're talking about the Ukrainian ones. And the Cossacks were kind of, they were from the area, they had their own style of governance called the hetmanate. They had their own communities. They did not necessarily always want to be part of the Russian Empire. And they tended to identify with the local population. The local population was mostly peasants and farmers, and they identified with this place, right? They didn't identify necessarily with the Russian center, but with this place. And over time, that Cossack identity and that peasant identity came together to form into what we now understand as Ukrainian national identity. But before that crystallized, already the Tsars were looking at this place, afraid of this place, because it wasn't behaving the way that they wanted it to behave. Increasingly in the 19th century, the Tsars implemented cultural and social policies that targeted non-Russian populations, including the peoples of Ukraine. And peoples is intentional here, right? There are a lot of different groups there. These policies have been exhaustively addressed in several studies. And if you're interested, I always recommend people start with Kepler's The Russian Empire, a multi-ethnic history, because this will help you think about some of these things. I'm only going to focus on one policy, though there are many policies that they use to try to pacify this population. And that is Tsar Nicholas I, the doctrine of official nationality. This policy underscored the Tsar and Russian intellectuals' adherence to so-called Great Russian chauvinism, an idea that asserted Russian cultural supremacy within the empire. The doctrine promoted nationality, orthodoxy, and autocracy. And of course, when I say nationality, this meant Russian nationality. And in this period, it's important to understand that when they say the word nationality, they really mean language, right? So Russian language. And so as part of the doctrine of official nationality, the Tsars begin using every tool at their disposal, including schools, to Russify the population and to push conversion. This resulted in high rates of Russian language usage and also orthodoxy in Ukrainian lands. And in this case, the empire used language policy as a tool to convert the profoundly mixed populations of the imperial borderlands to Russian, right? To make them Russian. The legacy of this moment and future Soviet attempts to Russify the population is really still evident in the high rates of Russian language in large swaths of Ukraine. So for example, when I lived in Odessa, people still speak Russian rather frequently, but we have to remember this is part of imperial policy. It's a legacy of imperial policy, as is the reason we're speaking English here today as opposed to something else, right? So the Russian Empire's successor state, the Soviet Union, was an empire from the onset as well. So you'll see claims that they were not imperial. I disagree with these claims. During World War I, the Ukrainians actually erected an independent Ukrainian state a few times. This is actually a really complicated history that I can't delve into right here because there's several different states. But they did erect an independent state. This independent state signed a separate peace agreement with Germany and Austria. So it was both identified as sovereign by itself as well as by outsiders. So it was an independent Ukrainian state. Before the end of World War I, the emerging Soviet Union recognized this. However, once World War I ended and there was no longer the threat of some sort of German retribution, the Bolsheviks immediately began invading Ukrainian territory. Right? So this shows us that the Bolsheviks and then later the Soviet Union were imperial from the beginning, despite what they claim. Ultimately, the Ukrainian attempt at peace and at independence was not successful. The Bolsheviks were able to squash the Ukrainian independence movement, and it was very brief. But one of the things I do want to talk about, and this is really a touchy subject, especially given some of the rhetoric that's going on now, is that this imperial violence actually prompted intergroup violence on the ground. So between 1919 and 1921 is perhaps one of the darkest points in Ukrainian history. Ukrainians, as well as Russians and other nationalities in the region, participated in widespread anti-Jewish violence and pogroms. This shift in interactions, I think, is directly linked to Bolshevik incursion in Ukraine. The pogroms actually exploded after the Bolshevik invasion and not necessarily before. And we do know that the first iterations of the Ukrainian state in the interwar had protections for Jews. So there is a good chance that the imperial jockeying of the Bolsheviks actually resulted in intergroup violence. So despite its very clear origins in the Russian Empire and its very imperial behavior during the so-called Civil War, the rhetoric of the USSR gave the impression that its leadership was anti-imperial. It constantly said, we're anti-imperial. Lenin authored several tracts on how non-imperial they were. And at least in their early years, some of their policies were too. But the imperialistic nature of the USSR, ultimately, it was unmistakable, especially in Ukraine. Here, Soviet officials begin the process of reversing favorable language policies. They began elevating Russian in classrooms and bureaucratic structures. They increased crackdowns on Ukrainian intellectuals and the Ukrainian peasantry via things like mass arrests, executions, deportations, and collectivization. These policies collectively intended to make Ukraine and Ukrainians Soviet, and increasingly Soviet meant Russian. In response, the Ukrainian peasantry fought back. They destroyed Soviet machinery, refused to collectivize. They asserted their Ukrainian nationality in public spaces. At this time, as in the Russian Empire, Ukrainian nationality was also closely linked to class, right? Remember how I told you that origins is in peasant origins? So their identity was deeply linked to peasant origins. And Stalin was growing increasingly frustrated with this group of people because not only were they destroying machinery, refusing to collectivize, but they were just refusing to fall into the Soviet fold in the way that he wanted them to. And so he ultimately pursued a policy of genocide against the Ukrainian population. And this was in the 1933 terror famine called the Holodomor. The relationship between imperialism and genocide has really long been established in historical scholarship. So for example, the Herero, Armenian, Rwandan genocides, in addition to the Holocaust, all have connections to imperialism, be it the use of genocide as an imperialist tool or the emergence of genocide within imperial vacuums. The Holodomor fits within this larger trend, as it occurred within Soviet imperialism as the Soviets struggled to make the population Soviet. The state-sponsored famine, the Holodomor, resulted in the deaths of approximately 4 million Ukrainian residents. This included ethnic Ukrainians, as well as ethnic Russians, Jews, ethnic Germans, Tatars, and other Ukrainian peoples. The famine itself could have been avoided entirely had Stalin just not sent a majority of Ukraine's grain abroad to fund the first 5-year plan. But it wasn't just this sending of grain abroad that resulted in the Holodomor. When individuals, particularly Ukrainians, could not cough up the grain that was required of them, they began confiscating payment in kind. This means they would show up to someone's house, they would take their cows, they would take their animals, even their dogs, they would take all of the food out of their cupboards, and they would leave them with nothing to eat. And to compound matters further, villages and groups that were considered particularly unwieldy were blacklisted. So they would surround the entire village with the Red Army and secret police, and no one in, no one out. So they sat there and slowly starved to death. This one is really difficult when we talk about genocide, because we'll talk about genocide a little bit more later on, but one of the hardest things to prove is intent, right? How do you prove intent to murder? And the Holodomor is really hard in this regard because, well, Stalin didn't leave a lot of documents around, and he murdered large swaths of the population that participated in the 1937 purges, right? So they were just murdered after the fact. But we do have one document about the Holodomor in which Stalin said that he was going to, quote, deliver a crushing blow to Ukraine. So this is the most that we have as far as intent. But I, as a scholar, I'm comfortable calling it genocide. And this is still a debate, but I'm certainly comfortable doing this. So as I've already referenced a couple times in this talk, there are large swaths of contemporary Ukraine that were never in the Russian Empire. However, this land was part of the historic Ukrainian imagination. It's that place of the peasants and the Cossacks, right? That's what it is in their imagination. As well as part of historic Poland and later Austria-Hungary. So up until at least the Ukrainian War for Independence, most of the conflict in this territory was actually between Poles and Ukrainians. But ultimately, interwar Poland won a war both with the Soviets and the Ukrainians and was able to claim this territory during the interwar period. The Soviets only first expanded their power in what is contemporary Western Ukraine during World War II. So the first time that the Soviets actually occupied what is contemporary Western Ukraine, including places like Lviv, it was during World War II. And it was a direct result of a pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, right? Where they just sat down and they decided that they were going to carve independent Poland in two, and the eastern half was just going to go to the Soviet Union. And all the people in it, right? Just to the Soviet Union. And it's here, this is the first time that we see the Soviets begin to try to expand their imperial policies into what is contemporary Western Ukraine. So one of the ways that they did this is by implementing what Jan Gross, I know you can't see everything because the screen's a little cluttered over here, but this book is by Jan Gross, and it's called Revolution from Abroad. So what they did is, inside of this newly acquired Eastern Polish territory, which was also overlapping with contemporary Ukrainian territory, they began trying to push the Bolshevik Revolution from outside, right? Whereas the Bolshevik Revolution itself in Russia had been from the ground up, So they're trying to import it abroad. And the way that they did this is using a lot of the same tools that Stalin used to pacify the Soviet population during his periods after 1928. This included things like mass deportations, rapid collectivization, falsified elections, and extreme violence, as well as importing intellectuals and elites from the Soviet Union proper and then dropping them in Eastern Poland to build up Soviet bureaucracy. As you can imagine, the peoples of Eastern Poland were not very fond of this, right? This caused a lot of tensions between the Polish population and the Soviet population. The Soviets responded by deporting large swaths of the Polish population eastward. So they picked up to 50%. We still don't have really clear numbers on this, but up to 50% of the Polish population and moved them to Central Asia. They dropped them in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Siberia, and they also began deporting other so-called undesirables. So what we see here is them actually depopulating this once very Polish-Ukrainian place and turning it now into a Ukrainian-Russian place because they're moving Russians into the territory at the same time. But the period of Stalin and Hitler getting along with one another is relatively short-lived, right? That was a marriage that was never going to work. After all, Hitler hates communists more than he hates many people, right? So this was not going to work well. It was very short-lived, only about 2 years, but it was enough to make the mark, to really create tensions within that section of Polish society. And so Hitler decided to break the pact that he had with the Soviet Union. He invaded Eastern Poland as well as large swaths of Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc. And it was in this invasion that we saw another really dark moment in Ukrainian history. Responding to the brief Soviet occupation, as well as the extreme violence of the Soviet Union, they tended to buy into something that was called the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. Really hang on that word myth, please, right? So they inaccurately believed that Jews were somehow responsible for the Soviet occupation. And this resulted in large numbers of Ukrainian collaborators during World War II. And this is often what you see Mr. Putin citing, right? Is this moment in time. So during the war, the Nazis and their collaborators, which were often Ukrainians as well as others, murdered over 1.5 million Soviet Jews, many of which were actually Ukrainian Jews, right? So these are Ukrainian people. And during and after World War II, the Soviets introduced a series of population transfers. I've talked already about the Polish population transfer, but they also did things like deport the entire Tatar population from Crimea, right? So this emptying of Ukrainian space of the peoples that were there, either via mass murder and or imperial policy, and they begin replacing the people that were there mostly with ethnic Russians as well as Ukrainians. So a lot of the rhetoric you get today about how this is just full of ethnic Russians, a lot of that is actually a direct result of this imperial policy that occurred in the 1940s and 1950s. So after the incorporation of Eastern Poland into the Soviet Union permanently after World War II, because Stalin, of course, kept that large swath that he had invaded for that brief moment, clashes between Ukrainians and Russians actually died down a little bit. The late Soviet period is not as physically violent as some of the other things. This doesn't mean that there weren't intellectual squabbles. They just weren't as loud because, well, Soviet society did not allow for a very open, loud discourse about this. But it is important to understand that Ukraine remained a hot spot for underground resistance. It was a huge point of underground resistance. And the Ukrainian diaspora, which is just kind of short word for Ukrainian people that live abroad but maintain connections, the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States and Canada begin really preparing an intellectual elite for this very purpose early on. So they had this in place. Thus, it was no surprise that when they were allowed to break with the USSR, Ukraine immediately decided to do it, right? It was an overwhelming vote. Well over 90% of the population via referendum said, yes, We do not want to be part of the USSR, and we do not want to be part of Russia. We want to be an independent and sovereign state. The Russian Federation at this time acknowledged this sovereignty several times over. Most importantly, I think, for contemporary discussions during the Budapest Memorandum. As part of the memorandum agreement, Ukraine relinquished its entire nuclear arsenal, which was the third largest in the world at the time, in exchange for guarantees of territorial sovereignty, which Russia signed and the US signed. It was believable at the time, right? Because in the Russian Federation, after the immediate fall, it looked like Russia was moving in the right direction. It really did, for a while, look like they were making progress towards democracy. There was the great opening. Everybody was really excited about what was coming. And so this is why Ukrainians really believed that they could move together with the Russian Federation and actually move forward. This quickly began to change in 2000 with the ascent of Mr. Putin. So Mr. Putin seemed perfectly comfortable with an independent Ukraine early on. When he came to power, of course, Ukraine had maintained very close relationships with the Russian Federation. However, Ukraine was going through its own democratization process at the same time. This was slow, and it was not necessarily without hiccups. I think it's important to note that systemic transitions are never easy, right? You don't just wake up one morning and heck, we're democratic now, right? It takes time. And for Ukraine, it did take time, but they were constantly making steady progress towards democratization. The 2004 elections signaled a major leap in this direction. It was during these elections that a younger and charismatic Ukrainian nationalist by the name of Viktor Yushchenko ran for president. And much of the Ukrainian population supported him. It was very obvious in public discourse that he had the people behind him. But miraculously, the pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, won. Ukrainians began taking to the streets in every major city, and they were donning the color orange because that was the color of Yushchenko's campaign. This was very peaceful, it was not violent, and they were demanding another election. And they had a reason to do so, right? Outside observers had observed the elections, and they had seen that they were falsified, that there was an issue with them. And so they demanded this, and they got what they asked for. They got what they peacefully asked for. There was another election, and surprise, surprise, Yushchenko won, right? As they knew he would win. He won by a landslide. However, in that short period, Mr. Putin's secret police had managed to poison the man, right? And there had been a great deal of international controversy. This, coupled with the fact that the Ukrainian oligarchy was pushing back against him during his entire regime, made it so that he did very little in terms of progress. He was not able to get what he promised achieved. So when there was the next election cycle, Yanukovych, that same person who had helped rig an election before, became the president of Ukraine. Yanukovych is decidedly pro-Russian. There's no denying this at this point. He looks towards Russia, and he had, at least to the Ukrainian population, tried to pay lip service to the idea that there might be a potential way to move towards the West. And as you're getting closer and closer to 2013, he's saying, yep, we're going that direction, we're going that direction. And then overnight, he changes his mind. He refuses to enter into EU talks, and he starts proposing a plan for Ukraine to kind of sync up with the Russian Federation. Once again, Ukrainians did what they do best. They went to the streets and they said, hey, this is not cool. Many of them probably thought this was going to be something like the Orange Revolution, where enough of them will say something and something would change. However, Yanukovych decided to sic the military police as well as paramilitary organizations on the protesters. This resulted in the death of a little over 100 people in Freedom Square, or Maidan, in Kyiv. And they're now called the Heavenly 100. This was a really sustained moment of violence. It's a couple months. If you have a chance, I recommend watching Winter on Fire on Netflix, because this really gets at this moment to understand it a little bit better. In the long run, despite this violence, Ukrainians were able to push him out of power. He left and he absconded with large swaths of the national treasury. So he left. He went mostly to Eastern Ukraine and then to Russia. And there was another election in which they brought a democratically elected president to power. And he was very much pro-West. This is Poroshenko. He's a pro-Western kind of dude. And then in 2019, we saw the marker that Ukraine had arrived. They had become a full-fledged democracy. And this was the peaceful transition of power that occurred when Poroshenko lost the election, stepped down, as one does when they lose elections, and then, sorry, and then, and then Zelensky came to power and assumed power. And once we saw this transition, we knew that Ukraine had done it. They had made the transition. They had become democratic. This is, I think, what sent Putin over the edge, because then, it's lost, right? His goals of obtaining power are lost. He was already, though, beginning the process of this invasion immediately after Maidan. So that 2014 moment when he saw that the Ukrainians decided to force independent elections and force democratic leadership, he illegally occupied Crimea, annexed it using violence, despite what the media tells you, and he began backing so-called separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. And this war has been waging since 2014. Well over 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers died in this war before the escalation, right? So this is not a new war. This is an old war that is still going. So while this current escalation of Russian violence in Ukraine is certainly a continuation of some of this Russian imperial violence that I've talked about today, it's also something new, or at least a version of something old, if we think about the Holodomor. Most scholars of Ukraine agree that the current escalation is taking a genocidal turn. Legal scholars and prosecutors are, however, at least now, rather hesitant to make similar claims, because that bell cannot be unrung legally, right? It's a legal term with legal ramifications. Once entities like the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, recognize Russian behavior in Ukraine from 2022 to 2023 for what it is, genocidal, they must legally act on this claim. And this hesitancy, fueled by fear of the legal obligations entailed in accusations of genocide, is hardly new. We've seen this before as a global community. We saw it in Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and the list goes on. Genocide itself is both a scholarly and a legal term, which is what makes it so complicated for us to work with. As a legal term, it was codified in 1948 by the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the convention then defined genocide as, quote, the intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, again, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the groups, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. There are certainly some issues with this definition. I'm sure Dr. Klein-Pescevo can talk about this all day with you, right? But it's what we have. It's what we have to work with right now as a legal term. Some of the Russian behavior in contemporary Ukraine fits these patterns. There is clear evidence that the Russians regularly target civilians, including children, and have participated in mass torture and limited pit-style killings. However, killing civilians does not necessarily equal genocide. Systemic attacks on and torture of civilians is an abysmal practice which falls within other legally persecutable categories, including crimes against humanity and crimes against peace. One can have mass violence, torture, the decimation of civilian populations, and the like without it constituting genocide. This is something that really makes this term hard for us to grapple with. After all, many of us, I think in this room, can agree that violence is violence and it is all bad. But we might be asking ourselves, what's the difference. There is a major difference, and it's an important difference, and that's you can have mass murder on one hand, but then the intent to destroy all of it on the other hand. This is not only to murder the population, but to completely remove the culture and the identity from the world. That's what we're talking about when we talk about genocide. So Russia is clearly killing members of the group, causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life to bring about its physical destruction. But there is also mounting evidence that they are taking measures intended to prevent births within the group. Often in this war, Russians are deploying a rather common tool of genocide, and that's mass rape. This frequently occurs alongside the murder of a woman's significant other, which is preventing a birth within the group. And then this rape, as an act of violence, is serving many purposes for the aggressors. It dehumanizes victims. It stokes morale. Yeah, I hate saying that, but that it actually does. It stokes morale within the group. And it creates feelings of power and invincibility for soldiers. But it also, in some cases, actually prevents births within a group, as increasingly Ukrainian women are forced to carry the babies of their Russian rapists. And so this is preventing birth. Finally, there is mounting evidence that Russia has been active in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Ukrainian officials, as of now, have identified at least 14,000 Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped from their families and deported to the Russian interior to be raised as Russians. NGOs operating on the ground have slightly lower numbers, but we know it's happening regardless, right? The fight now is about numbers and not necessarily whether it's happening or not. Collectively, everything I've just said to this moment is crimes against humanity. Without intent, we can't call it genocide. The intent's usually the hardest thing to prove. Remember, I told you Stalin, it was hard to prove. Even the most well-known genocidaires, people who like to commit genocide, have been really good at trying to cover their tracks. Even Hitler tried to cover up his tracks. However, Mr. Putin, Russian politicians, news outlets, and everyday folks in Russia, as of now, seem to be flaunting their crimes and declaring their intent to anybody willing to listen. The clearest piece of evidence that we have to date is a document that Timothy Snyder has dubbed Putin's Genocide Handbook. This was a document that was released to the public in April of 2022. It was authored by Russian officials and then put out on Russian Channel 1, which is the main news outlet. This document proves intent. The main claim of the text is that Russia intends to denazify Ukraine. And you're going to have to follow me on a ride here for a moment so that we can make sense of this. Denazify Ukraine. Now, the idea that contemporary Ukraine is a Nazi state is absurd for a couple reasons, right? We've talked about Nazism in the past, but today it's absurd. And the idea of Nazism, though, is important to Russians for another reason. In Russian history, there is no greater enemy than a Nazi. And this is something that they witnessed firsthand with World War II. I encourage you to read about the siege of Stalingrad and the siege of Leningrad and the things that Russians experienced there. So to use the word Nazi, that's automatically going to trigger all of the emotions that are involved in that within the population. And then there's been no greater victory in Russian history than the Great Patriotic War, which is what we call World War II, right? No greater victory. So with that one word, just the one word Nazi, you're triggering all of these feelings inside of the Russian population. But I don't think they're using the term Nazi like Nazis. They're using it to trigger this feeling that we're talking about. And they're using it as a euphemism, much in the ways that, say, for example, during the Rwandan genocide, Hutus use their term cockroach to refer to their Tutsi victims, right? So we see this euphemism type thing happening. But we couldn't necessarily make the leap from denazification to de-Ukrainianization without something that said it. Well, this very same document says that, quote, denazification of Ukraine means de-Ukrainianization. end quote, right? So there's no ambiguity there. And the main assertions of the document include that, quote, the name Ukraine cannot be kept of a title of any fully denazified state entirely on the territory liberated from the Nazi regime, end quote. It goes on to say, quote, the elimination of armed Nazi formations, which means any armed formations of Ukraine, including the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as the military, informational, and educational infrastructure cannot exist, end quote. And, quote, denazification, again, is de-Ukrainianization, end quote. In short, the goal of Russian aggression in the region is to ensure that the name Ukraine, the Ukrainian state, everything Ukrainian, and if necessary, the Ukrainian people are eradicated. This is clear intent of genocide. I don't want to talk too much about their plans, but they do have a big plan for what they're going to do if you have questions about it later on. What I can say, though, is this intent is clear. And in my scholarly opinion, I think we have enough to say that Russia planned on committing genocide on Ukrainian territory. In the places that they occupy and in the places that they have been removed from, they have begun implementing genocidal policies. And these genocidal policies are intimately connected to Russian imperial ambitions, past and present, in Ukraine. I got it all in a timely manner, so we got time for questions.
You mentioned that the language is the same, but is Ukrainian close to Russian?
No, they're not the same. I would say about 20% different.
Is it like Spanish and Italian or something like that?
It's more like Spanish and Portuguese.
That's pretty close.
It's pretty close, but they're different languages. They have different historical developments.
If somebody speaking Russian, can they understand somebody speaking Ukrainian?
Russians generally can't understand Ukrainian, but Ukrainians generally can't understand Russian. There'll be a lot of like false friends and there'll be a lot of overlap. But it's about as into like a Polish person listening to a Ukrainian speak, they understand as much as a Russian person, right? Ukrainian would be the thing that was bridging Polish and Russian together. So they are linguistic differences. They're different languages. There's different sounds. There's different elements of the alphabet. Ukraine has some different characteristics in the alphabet that is not present. There's a sound in Russian that's not present in Ukrainian. So there are differences. But are they close? Yeah, as are most languages that occur next to each other or develop next to each other.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I learned so much. So my question regards one of the big takeaways I come from your presentation about the multiness of the space that is now Ukraine and the issue of genocide, because so much of Ukrainian identity is civic. You know, because it's a bunch of folks. Does this have any impact on defining, understanding, and eradicating genocide?
This is a hard question. I'm processing it in my brain real quick. So I can say that it's less multi than it was in the past. So if we would have gone back, 150 years before, it was much more multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual. It was a very intermixed place. But it's become less so because of all of the imperial jockeying that's occurred there. Because it's at this crossroads between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Empire. And then it's later at this, crossroads between Germany and Russia. And there's all kinds of people that have competing interests in Ukraine. And this has defined it, but it's also ethnically cleansed it, for lack of better words, right? It used to be 1.5 million Jews in Ukraine. Now, it still has one of the larger Jewish populations out there, but it's much smaller. It used to be a ton of Poles in Ukraine. Now some are going back, but the level of Polishness in Ukraine is certainly less than what it was a century ago. There used to be a lot of ethnic Germans there. Now there are almost none. Bulgarians as well, Hungarians. So the population has become increasingly sorted as a result of this imperial jockeying. So I guess the downfall is that it's actually become more homogenous because of this. And the civic national identity is something that's newly developing. It hasn't always been civic. There have been clashes between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, but they are developing the civic nationalism to encompass also the ethnic Russians, right, that are so much part of Ukrainian society. You can, believe it or not, be ethnically Russian and speak Russian and still be Ukrainian, right? So this is one of the complicated things about it. But I don't know about the prevention of genocide bit. I don't have an answer. Yeah.
My grandmother used to tell the story. She escaped from Ukraine in the early 1900s. And she said that the Russians came to her house and basically tried to convince her to become Russian. And if you didn't, you got shot. Would that be considered the Bolshevik Revolution at that particular time?
What years?
I don't remember the year, but it's early 1900s.
Bolshevik Revolution is 1917, and it's later in 1917 because there's an earlier revolution, and then you'll have the Russian Civil War that's continuing through 1922. And then you have the Ukrainian War for Independence, as well as anarchist movements that overlap with that. So if it's then, but you do have Russification policies in the late 19th, early 20th century. They're just not, they're different than the Bolshevik Revolution. But you could have seen maybe like pushes at Russian language usage, especially in schools and stuff like that. And folks tended to perceive that as being forced to be Russian. So that might be why that was the family story that came down from that. But I wouldn't know exactly until I knew the area and the year and kind of what was going on in that place.
She's from Kyiv, but I couldn't tell you where she escaped to.
So are you asking if the pushing of NATO is what led to the escalation in violence? No. It's been part of the plan all along. Ukraine has made it very clear that they've been working towards NATO integration. Working towards EU integration has been part of the plan at least since 2014. This has been everybody knows it, right? They've been talking about it for a long time. Now, Putin didn't invade, well, he did invade in 2014, right? But it's not because of NATO. I honestly think he wanted to get it in before NATO expanded, because if NATO expanded, then he wouldn't be able to.
People have used the analogy of, Russia or Soviet Union putting missiles in Cuba, and we didn't stand for that. Kind of the same idea. He was threatened by NATO to such an extent that he reacted. And we were too pushy by doing that.
Nah, I think he had a plan all along. I mean, this is convenient, but he's been using imperialist rhetoric since at least 2002, probably even earlier than then. He always harkens back to like the Great Russian Empire. He's a big fan of people like Peter the Great. He talks about integrating things like Ukraine, but also Moldova. There's the invasions of Georgia that are clear examples that they planned on invading. It was just a matter of when, and this created the opportunity for him to have a convenient excuse. But there was also a plan just released like 2 days ago, maybe, of integrating Belarus by the end of 2023, I think is what it was. So they're also making that move. So this is about Russian imperialism and Russian empire wanting to achieve its great glory in a world that's kind of beginning to move beyond that. Yeah.
Thank you. First, thank you very much. It's interesting to listen to you. Okay, my name is Anatoly Rapoport. I'm originally from Odessa.
You did my Fulbright interview. I remember you, Anatoly. I was like, I know you.
I have two passports, Russian and American passport. Just to let people know where my loyalty is. With Ukraine, I still have family there. It's about Professor Milhausen, who was pushing this idea of NATO's expansion and escalation. What I want to ask you is, I keep hearing this idea of NATO expansion. And the idea, yes, NATO has become bigger than it used to be. But don't we, using this term expansion, that the connotation of the expansion is aggression. Should we try to eliminate this term itself from the Ukrainian-Russian narrative? Otherwise, it's hard to explain to everyone that it's not an expansion. It's a natural process that depends not on original NATO, but new,
100%. Language matters, always. And when we use the term expansion, we're implying that NATO is somehow like rolling into places and being like, you're in NATO now. And then they roll into the next place and they're like, you're in NATO now, right? That's not the case. People elect to join NATO. This is not, and it's a long process that requires both parties kind of working together. So it's not expansion in the traditional way. But the reason why they like this word expansion so much is because it looks like one empire is picking on another empire and they can go back to that imperial rhetoric that they like to have, right? This empire is invading us. We must get them back. And so, yeah, I would love to see I honestly hadn't thought about it until you just brought it up. But yes, 100%. And Odessa Mama. I'm with you.
Thanks for your great presentation. I would like to just make a comment about that NATO question. I'm from Iran, and I'm seeing the same mechanism expanding in that part of the world. So I'm familiar with the Russian imperialist expansions and portions of Iran were annexed to that country. So no alien to that. But I think the role of NATO is too big to ignore. Right now, the Azerbaijan, the country, is having a stronger connection with NATO, and Iran is feeling the pressure of having a NATO presence to its borders. So I wouldn't see the prospect of a war between Iran and Azerbaijan just because of that threat. So I think there is some room for us to consider a role for the NATO, and I don't want to use the word, that's just for NATO presence as a justification. It's a threat big enough for a country like Russia with that history to feel threatened. Would you still believe that's not sort of a strong reason?
I think it creates fear. I think you're right. It creates fear. Save one example, and we do have one example of NATO being the aggressor, right? But other than that, they don't invade places, right? We do have that one example, which happened in post-Yugoslav space, right? Which everybody cites. But I don't know if the fear is legitimate. I think it creates fear. People are afraid, but what are they afraid of? And nobody's put it in words that make sense to me other than it's NATO, right? Is NATO going to invade Iran? I don't think so. Why is Iran worried about Azerbaijani-NATO relations? What is the root of that? And I don't have the answer, but I don't know that NATO is enough to create that root, because we do know that Azerbaijani, Armenian, Iranian relationships, they're all very complex, right? What's going on there is very complex, and it's a long history of complex relations that can't be boiled down to NATO. So maybe it plays a role, yes.
Yeah. It can definitely play a role in that dilemma. But I'm saying that although NATO has not invaded any other country, but it's the shield, the protective shield that it provides can embolden other countries to take steps that wouldn't take otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's the psychological impact.
Yes,
being
certainly.
part of a big military bloc.
100%, yes, because once you're in NATO, it triggers a response. So that means that place is no longer invadable. So that certainly, that matters for that reason.
But this shield is only if NATO countries invaded, not the other way.
Yeah, if the NATO country is invaded, NATO's not going to go kill other people, hopefully, right? No guarantees. I can't make any guarantees in history.
So I've got a question, your opinion on what an end result of peace looks like, other than the full withdrawal of Russian forces. And I ask that in the context of, the Ukrainians have been very brave, but they've also been armed to the teeth by the West, billions and billions of dollars. And so, and it's in the West's interest, I think, to see a weaker Russia. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't have done that. But at some point, there's going to be that spigot's going to start decreasing at some point. People are going to tire of that. And so I guess my question is, because you made a comment earlier that Ukrainians would fight to the death, and they're certainly very brave people that are fighting. But if that spigot starts lowering or gets reduced, or there's the threat of that, what are the Ukrainians, in your opinion, willing to sacrifice territorially or otherwise in order to get a cessation to hostilities?
So the question is, what does peace, like tangible peace, look like? And to what extent will Ukraine kind of make concessions in order to achieve peace? And what does it look like if everybody fights to the last man, woman, and child? Does that sound like a good? Yeah, I was like, all right. I was like, I just added that, my bad. So my answer is complicated. I think that if you would have asked this question in 2021, there may have been a world in which Ukraine may have been willing to let Crimea go. Maybe. But it's done. There is no winning without Russia removing themselves entirely from sovereign Ukrainian territory. And yes, the West may cut off the spigot, so to say, but it's going to be like Afghanistan. It's going to be like Vietnam. Nobody's going to stop fighting. And so Russia will win nothing. It'll be something that goes on and on and on and on. You cannot kill the spirit of a nation that easily. It's not an easy thing to do. But ideally, and the thing that I want, but I don't know if it's going to happen, I think the ideal conclusion would be that Russia wakes up tomorrow and says, my bad, and leaves. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But if you want like my ideal situation, that would be my ideal situation. But I don't know what's going to happen. I have no clue how long this will last.
Just a brief follow-up then. So assuming Zelensky maybe had an aneurysm or something and said, I would like to negotiate a settlement, you think he would have no support in Ukraine for that?
I don't think so, no. Maybe a little bit. I mean, you might have people that are war weary, that are tired of fighting, right? This is always going to wear on populations. But I think it's just, in reality, Russian aggression is just pissing off Ukrainians more. And so their response is becoming increasingly ratcheted up in response to this. So even people who were not very radically on one side or the other before, I mean, I have friends in Kharkiv, for example, Russian speakers, grew up Russian speaking, and the minute escalation happened, they're like, I'm learning Ukrainian, screw this. They won't even like use it on Facebook because they're just that mad. And so I think that it would be an impossible victory. It would be a futile victory. I don't think much would come of it, but I have no clue what's coming next. I wish I did. I wish I had an answer.
Just following on from that, how much is Putin the key here? And if Putin was no more, if somehow Putin was eliminated tomorrow, would it all be over?
So the question is, if Putin dropped dead tomorrow, would it all be over? I don't think so, no. Early on in the escalation, all of us wanted to believe that that it was him, right? This was his idea. He did this. It's just this one dude. And we did see early on widespread protests in Russia, right? Extreme widespread. But the kind of totalitarian-esque machine just clamped down on it so quickly that there's no space for it to flourish anymore. And we are seeing that large swaths of the Russian population have bought in, right? They do believe in this war. It is a Russian war at this point, not Mr. Putin's war, which is what I was calling it the first 2 months, Mr. Putin's war. So Putin dies tomorrow, Medvedev's right there to take his place, right? And we have him on the news, 2 days ago, making claims about expansion. And he was talking about trying to expand into Eastern Poland, which I'm pretty sure Poland was not fond of. But yeah, there's enough people to take his place at this point. The thing we could hope for is that it would create enough instability for the people in Russia that want an open public sphere to actually call for it. But as long as the state is powerful enough to clamp down on the Russians that do call for it, it won't happen. Yeah.
What about the Russian economy? Won't it get to a point where it's so bad that people just kind of give up?
So the question is, what about the Russian economy? And won't it get so bad that people just give up? I don't think so. This is hard. So Putin already strategically started shifting the Russian economy probably about 10 years ago to be more inward facing and to have strategic relationships with other partners like China. So he already started shifting the policy. Russia has a lot of resources. They are massive. They can function internally on their own if they have to. So they have everything they need to function. Now, are the sanctions having a dramatic impact on everyday lives of Russians? Yes. Has it been enough to date to get them to try to topple Putin? No. Will it? I don't know. You could have the same kind of dig-in that you're seeing in Ukraine. The same thing could happen in Russia, where people get increasingly mad at the West for sanctions. They get increasingly mad about the situation, and they want to fight to the last person. So I don't know, but probably not. I don't think it will get bad enough that that would be the thing that would topple it. But I could be wrong. Again, I said early in this speech, I'm a historian. We peddle in the past, not in futures. So futures are all kind of a gray zone for us, all right?
How did Ukrainians maintain their national identity during the Soviet Union? That's one. And next to that, why is an independent Ukraine so threatening to the Russian Federation?
Oh, Lord. So how did they maintain their Ukrainian identity? This is a really complex thing. There are lots of great books on this. I recognize, like Vik Statsevich has one on the Ukrainian diaspora. But essentially, most of this work was done in diaspora. Large swaths of the Ukrainian population left during the Ukrainian War for Independence, and then left after World War I, World War II. And there's actually 3 waves of diaspora movement, right, that developed. They mostly developed in the United States and Canada with really strong Ukrainian institutions focused on Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity. So you have them over here, for the most part, forming this intellectual elite basis. And then you have everyday Ukrainians who took their national identities home. Ukrainian didn't disappear in the public sphere in conversations. People are still speaking Ukrainian sometimes in the streets, right? The Soviet Union can't kill that. But also practicing culture at home, doing things like specific food practices, carry them. So I don't know if any of you have heard of like vareniki, for example, or the vareniki pierogi fight. I know some of you have heard of it, right? Or like vyshyvanka or other cultural practices. So these artistic practices that they could root national identity in until it was safe to root national identity in a state. So it's both at home in these private practices, but also in the diaspora itself in these more public practices. And then, the minute the Soviet Union began imploding on itself, they kind of came together to form an independent Ukrainian state. So it took work, but they did it. The second half of that question is too hard to answer. The invasion of Ukraine right now is all about, Russia's afraid of independent Ukraine. Because what does that mean? For Russia, that means that the country on its border is making decisions for itself as opposed to decisions for them. And if there's one thing that historians know, it's that whenever power is threatened, people get scared. And they can either say, hey, we can readjust to the new normal, or they could freak out and lash out, right? And Russia is doing the lash out version of this, right? Because their power, their border, they feel threatened even if it might necessarily not be a threat.
You mentioned the Russian document speaking on the eradication of Ukrainian education. Has this been a theme in the past for Russia? I know that during the Soviet Union time, they often tried to devote resources to Russification, and that included having to teach school in the Russian language. Is this part of the policy that Russia is trying to implement at this time in Ukraine?
The so-called genocide handbook that I talked about, Tim Snyder has a New Yorker article that covers the whole genocide document. I recommend reading it because he really walks through everything there. Their plans include school. I kind of skipped over them, but they did think they're going to have 25 years of de-Ukrainianization, which means shifting to Russian language in schools. They talked about killing the intellectual elite because they could not be de-Ukrainianized. This is something that we saw begin in Bucha, for example. So we've seen these processes begin. Also in occupied Kherson, before it was liberated, they had already begun forcing Russian language policies. So new teachers showed up in school, and all of a sudden all of the kids had to learn Russian. And this started happening. So it's always building on old policy. Empires tend to build on what they know. And so it's always building on that, but with a new twist. Soviet policy towards language is messy. I tried to avoid having this conversation because it's complicated. Early in the Soviet period, the Soviet Union promoted linguistic peculiarity, right? They promoted using Yiddish in the public sphere. They promoted using Ukrainian in the public sphere. It was this idea that in order to become Soviet, you first had to learn to be your nationality. So you're going to be Ukrainian, you're going to learn to be Ukrainian, and that's going to be your path to becoming a Soviet citizen. This really shifted with the ascent of Stalin in 1928, and he started ruling back this policy and implementing Russification. So language policy in the Soviet Union is never static, but we do know that Russification was part of it at several key moments.
Enter or not to enter NATO is a decision of independent countries. So if Russia hears about Ukraine or Iran hears about Azerbaijan, it's the problem of Iran and Russia, and nobody must not suffer from this. So it's my point, and Russia is 11th reason out of 10 of this war. So it's not about it. And I have one question. Since 2014, all Ukrainians have been waiting for a breakdown of Russia. And we saw some tries about Siberian Republic, but it failed. So from like historical and scholarly point of view, is there a possibility of breakdown of Russia Federation?
So this was a comment and question, and I think the comment is really important. The first part of the comment is that it is the decision of an independent and sovereign state to decide whether or not they are going to join NATO. So that is Ukraine's decision, not Russia's decision. The second one is the 11 out of 12 of the reasons for this war are Russia. Right? This is a Russian war of aggression. And then there was a question about
Can Russia break down?
Will Russia implode on itself? So I think Russia has potential. Like if there is enough uprising inside, if enough people demand open democracy, as they did in the collapse of the Soviet Union, if you have another open moment like that, that could be glorious. Do I think it's going to happen right now? No. But I would love to see that. Nothing would make me happier. Most of the people in this room don't know that my second language was Russian, right? And then Ukrainian. So I respect and love Russian culture as well. I would love nothing more to see Russian become a democratic state that is independent, that is not in this situation. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening right now. But I could be wrong, and please God, let me be wrong, right? Since you haven't had.
Yes, so I was in Ukraine in 2014. And one thing you were talking about Ukrainian identity, it seemed to me, and I'm trying to see, I was only there for a week or 10 days, but it seemed to be that historic homes all seem to have an image of the Ukrainian national poets. And I'm wondering whether that's an important part of the preservation of identity. And I'm sorry, I don't recall the name.
Shevchenko.
Yes. And it was it was striking how often you saw that image in people's homes. And I was wondering whether that was just a selection bias because where I happened to go, or whether that was in fact part of maintaining Ukrainian identity.
Yes. So the question is about whether a really famous poet by the name of Taras Shevchenko is part of maintaining Ukrainian national identity. Yes. Shevchenko is everywhere, right? Like every major park, he's just staring down at you, usually with a book and something else valiant in his hand, right? This is part of, before we got to this escalation, most of us that work on Ukraine were trying to figure out how Ukraine was going to make this transition from some very not so great national heroes to some better national heroes. This is not unique about Ukraine, right? We have not so great national heroes as well here where we are. But they do have individuals like Bandera, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, not a nice dude, right? Or other national heroes that partook in anti-Jewish violence, for example. So they're looking for other people to look back to. And people like Shevchenko or Lesa Ukrainka, these are people that they can look to find linguistic culture and artistic culture and build their national identity there. And this shift is actually part of that, them trying to reorient, right? And sometimes it's reorienting the other way. And it was in 2014 as well, where we also saw streets named after Bandera. But then we also see this other movement. So this was part of them coming to terms with their own past, and then it got interrupted by Russia.
In your conversations with Ukrainians and your monitoring of Ukrainian press, how much of an issue, if any, do Ukrainians debate or believe that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan by the United States in the fall of 2021 accelerated or contributed to the invasion of Ukraine?
The question is, to what extent are Ukrainian scholars and reporters kind of debating the disaster of American intervention in Afghanistan and the rapid withdrawal and its impact on Ukraine? My answer is I don't know. I have no clue. I think if there's one thing that's been looming in this is not actually Afghanistan, it's Syria. So this has been the thing that has been the biggest discussion because Russia was heavily involved in what happened in Syria. And so that's starting to become the larger conversation. But as far as Afghanistan, I just don't know. I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Yeah, and then...
I want to add something to the question about Shevchenko and development. It's interesting that in the Soviet time, you probably know, that Ukrainian, I speak Ukrainian and Russian. The Ukrainian was taught in schools along with Russian. I'm a Russian speaker, although I speak Ukrainian. The difference, I think, the focus was not the language itself. The focus was the social positioning of the language and the political positioning of the language. The same with Shevchenko and Franco and Lesser Ukrainka, all these authors, because they came from a very humble origin. Shevchenko was a Serb. That's why they were promoted in the Soviet time.
Yep.
And traditionally, they became symbols of Ukrainian culture. Now, although there are so many of those who were not promoted during the Soviet time, but they are coming to the surface. It's just
No, 100%, yeah. I think that is a very important point because the Soviets preferred people who appeared to be in the lower class hierarchy because it played into Soviet policy. So I think this is really important. Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Just a quick follow-up. The gentleman that I referred to earlier, the Chicago professor, is called John Mearsheimer.
Yeah.
His YouTube lecture, Why is the Ukraine the Westfall? 28 million views.
Well,
That's a lot of views.
somebody should have told him not to say the Ukraine. Maybe should have started there. But
I'm not saying, I'm just telling you, this is where this
Yeah.
intellectual firepower behind that view.
yeah, no, there's a lot of
Cogent speaker, and I was pretty, I was kind of amazed it had that many views.
yeah.
The most famous pragmatist theoretian
Is he?
in the field of politics. Yeah. He's very famous.
he is in every syllabus, in every curriculum.
And his books are.
Actually, most of us are doing what we call decolonizing our syllabi now, especially when it comes to Ukraine. So he's not in our syllabi anymore.
But it's good to debate, to put his view, I think, in front of people and let the students hash that out.
Oh yeah, certainly for but when you're talking about core historiographical or theoretical canon, those kinds of things, you want to make sure that students are also getting what we call the subaltern view or the view of colonized people, because traditionally the view of colonizer has always been dominant. So it's our job in the classroom to kind of flip those upside down. And so I tend to focus more on colonized people. But you can there's all kinds of classes out there. There's lectures online. People can consume as much information as possible and make their own decisions. That's one of the great things about being here as opposed to in a place where Channel 1 runs everything.
Can you explain the difference between the Russian occupation in Crimea versus the war in the eastern part of Ukraine, where it appears, maybe I'm wrong, it appears that before this invasion a year ago that there was peace in Ukraine, in Crimea, whereas there was war in the eastern part of Ukraine.
So what happened in Crimea is a bunch of Russian soldiers showed up. They surrounded the Rada, which is essentially the place where the Senate and the local governance is working. They said, we're going to have a referendum, right? And then people went door to door with machine guns and a thing and said, vote, right in front of me, right? That's what happened. I mean, it wasn't widely said, but that's what happened. That's what happened in Kherson. That's what happened in Mariupol. That's what happened in all of these places. They showed up and they said, vote. So it wasn't peaceful. It wasn't peaceful at all. Lots of people were disappeared in Crimea. We don't even know how many yet. We still don't know. People just disappeared off the face of the planet. Where? I don't know. So it wasn't peaceful. It might have appeared peaceful, but that's what Russia wants you to believe. Now, what's happening? Was happening until this recent escalation in Luhansk and Donetsk, which is eastern Donbass region. Russia wanted everyone to believe, and I think even a lot of Ukrainianists believed in the beginning, that this was a separatist movement. Right? This was pro-Russian elements inside of Donetsk and Luhansk that wanted to be independent from Ukraine and join Russia. Are there Ukrainians that believe this? There are some, right? To say that no Ukrainians believe this would be an absolute lie. Do I think, and do most of us think at this point, that a majority of the population in Luhansk and Donetsk wanted to cede? No. We have credible evidence that they were essentially shipping Russian soldiers across the border from the border to serve as so-called separatists. It was funded by Russia, so we know that was money there. Russian weapons were involved in the mix. And then also this depopulation that I talked about that happened with other imperial movements, what you saw is this mass influx of what we call IDPs, or internally displaced people. So large groupings of people from Donetsk and Luhansk left those regions and went into the interior of Ukraine. So the war was fought not in a completely depopulated place, but in a place where large swaths of the population left. And so it gives this false impression that they wanted this, right? And certainly Russian propagandists have been working very hard to make sure that you believe they wanted this. I don't think so right now. But this will not be something we can parse out until the conflict is over, and until people have actual free access to these places. We won't have answers until then, as much as we want them. All right, I think that's it. Rebecca's doing this.